In this screencast, we're going to take a look at some various issues and or problems related to psychological research. One of those issues has to do with the use of animals. About 60% of Americans believe that it's okay to use animals for research purposes. Now, that's over half. That it's not a landslide by any stretch, but the majority of people believe in it. Now, the question is, why? Okay, why would we use animals instead of human beings if we're wanting to find out about human behavior? Well, over the years we have found that human and animal behavior is very, very similar in certain situations. For example, the effects of rewards and punishments on animals, very similar to human beings. The effects of drugs and things like addiction, very similar on animals and human beings. So, there are certain things that you can use animals for much more easily than using human beings. For example, reproduction. Suppose that we want to study 8 generations of human beings and see if we can find out if intelligence runs within families. You're talking about 200 years of research if you're looking at human beings, or approximately there. But for animals, let's say that we study rats and we study intelligence in rats and study 8 generations of rats. We can do that relatively quickly. It's also a whole lot easier to breed specific animals together. So, for example, we pick out the smartest rats and we breed those together. We can't do that with human beings. We can't say, okay, we want everybody that's in the National Honor Society to get together in the morning and we're going to assign you a partner. That's not okay. All right, so we can do things like that with animals that we cannot do with humans. And therefore, most people support the use of animals for research. Now, in terms of human beings in research, the APA, that is the American Psychological Association, they have very, very strict guidelines as far as using human beings in research. First of all, if you participate in a research project, you are guaranteed confidentiality. They can't go out without your permission and say, hey, Johnny participated in this study and we found out this. Okay, so your identity is protected. There's a variety of other things that they do not allow you to do to human beings in terms of treatment, trickery, things of that nature. So we'll talk about some very specific examples of research here in the future that may have been ethically inappropriate years ago. But today, the APA has very strict guidelines associated with it. Your book talks more specifically about it on page 42. Now let's talk about some other problems related to experiments. One is that basically we have found over the years that subjects in experiments, they will try to figure out what the experiment's about. Typically, you won't tell them exactly what you're studying because we've found that the subjects will try to please the experimenter. If they think they know what you're looking for, people have a tendency to try and act like they think you want them to. Now, obviously, if we're trying to study human beings, we don't want people modifying their behavior just because they want us to be happy. So that's an issue. That's something we have to guard against. Another example is the Hawthorne effect. The Hawthorne effect basically is the idea that if a person knows they're being observed or watched or studied, they may change their behavior simply because of that knowledge. Years ago, they did an experiment back in the early 1900s in Hawthorne, Illinois, basically, is where this came from, but it was in a factory. And they studied various things like increasing the lighting in the factory, and they found that the productivity in the factory went up. They increased the temperature. They did a variety of other things. Then they decided, okay, let's check and see, okay, what happens if we lower the lighting? What happens if we lower the temperature? And what they found was that no matter what they did, productivity kept going up. And they finally had to come to the conclusion that the reason for that was simply that people knew they were being observed. They knew they were being watched. And because of that, they were producing more. So you have to be careful for that as well. A third thing is experimenter subjectivity. If the experimenter has a specific reason why they want the experiment to conclude a certain way, if they want it to work or if they don't want it to work, they can sometimes subjectively, meaning they're biased, they can influence the people, the subjects in the experiment. And you don't want that to happen. So one technique that they have used over the years is to try and prevent this is called the double-blind technique. Let's say that we are studying the effect of a new drug on ADHD subjects. Okay? So what you will do is you will probably have two groups of subjects. You'll have an experimental group and a control group. The experimental group will get the medicine, they'll get the new drug to see what kind of an effect it has on them. But you also have to give the other group something, so you give them a placebo, a fake drug, a fake treatment, and that way they don't know if they're getting the drug or not. So as far as the subjects are concerned, they all think they're getting the medication. Now, so they're blind as far as knowing for sure what they're getting. The double-blind part comes in when the experimenter themselves, the person who's directly in contact with the subjects, what we will do a lot of times is make sure that that person or those people do not know who's getting the medication and who's not. So if the experimenter doesn't know whether the person's getting actual medication or whether they're getting a placebo, then they can't be biased. They can't influence the behavior of the actual subject. That's called the double-blind technique. In other words, the subject and the experimenter are both blind as far as which group they're in. Now, you may think, okay, well, if both people are blind, how does anybody know whether the research works or not? Somebody way up the food chain knows. Somebody above that experimenter in the research, somebody up above knows which group, which person is in which group. So those things are taken care of. Let's look at one more thing before we finish, and that is an area that sometimes you talk about in psychology, sometimes you don't. It's known as parapsychology. Para meaning to the side of or beyond what we would normally consider psychology. Things that are kind of out there. Things that, again, some people believe in, some people don't. ESP. ESP stands for extrasensory perception. So if you think of the 5 basic senses, sight, hearing, taste, touch, smell, extrasensory perception would refer to a 6th sense or something extra, another way of obtaining information. So, you know, obviously if I hear something or I see it or I taste it or touch it or smell it, I'm getting information. And my brain and my activities, my behavior may be impacted by that. But what ESP has to do with is, in other words, it's saying we're not getting information from any of those 5 basic senses, but somehow, in some way, shape, or form, we're getting information through another sense. Now, all of these things that are listed on this slide are considered forms of ESP. ESP is kind of like an umbrella term that encompasses many different things. So telepathy, that is mental communication. The idea that I could think something and you could perceive my thoughts. You could read my mind. That's telepathy. Precognition. would be somebody being able to tell things that are going to occur in the future. Okay? Like somebody looking in a crystal ball and saying, okay, here's what I see coming up, for you this next year. Being able to see those things ahead of time. How do they know it? Well, there's no way they can guarantee the knowledge, so basically, we believe that, or some people anyway, believe that that's an extra sense. Okay? Clairvoyance is being able to perceive things that are occurring, like, for example, now, but yet there's no way you should be able to know it. A lot of times you'll hear about cases where there's a crime, let's say a kidnapping, and the police will talk to, someone who specializes in ESP, and they will ask them questions, and that person may say, well, I sense that the person who's kidnapped is located in an area around such and such, and I sense that this is happening and that's happening. Now, how do they know that? Well, they have no particular way of knowing it. But the idea there is some people believe that if they can do that, that's an example of clairvoyance. Being able to perceive things where they don't have specific information or a specific way of knowing it. Psychokinesis or psychokinetic abilities, or sometimes it's called telekinesis, that would be kind of like Stephen King's example of Carrie, the book or the movie if you've seen it. Somebody who's able to mentally move and control things with their mind. In the movie Carrie, the girl is able to do all kinds of things, force things to happen simply because she thinks about it, and she causes all kinds of chaos. Well, again, most of us look at these things, telepathy, precognition, clairvoyance, and psychokinetic ability. Most of us look at this and say, hey, we don't believe it unless we see it. You're going to have to prove it. And the problem is most people can't. Most of the time, people can't prove that. If you go up to somebody and say, okay, read my mind right now, at this moment, what am I thinking? Most people can't do it. And when they can't do it, we generally say, okay, you have not been able to justify that this exists, and so we downplay it. Now, most scientists, and psychologists are scientists, most psychologists do not believe in ESP. Okay, they have very serious doubts about this. Now, I got to be fair. The proponents of ESP, the proponents of these things, they will tell you that ESP is not something abnormal, that it's not something bizarre or strange. They claim, for the most part, that everybody has it. Every single person has the ability for ESP. It's simply that some people are able to perceive things from it better than others. For example, my hearing is not the greatest. You may be able to hear sounds that I can't. But that doesn't mean that I look and say, well, that sound doesn't exist because I can't hear it. The proponents of ESP, they say, hey, just because you can't do it, you don't have the ability of precognition, doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. They simply say it's another thing that some people have and some people are good at that others aren't. Again, scientifically, that's what we have to emphasize here in psych. Scientifically, we want proof. We want to be able to put a person in a laboratory and say, do this. And 99% of the time, that doesn't work. And so therefore, there are major doubts as far as ESP is concerned.